I'm Ron Edwards with ChineseEconomicHistory.com, and we're here today at the World Economic History Congress at Kyoto. This is the first year that the World Economic History Congress has made it away from the West, the first time in the Far East, and so it's quite an occasion to interview in this series of interviews prominent economic historians. And today we're honored to have Professor Kenneth Pomeranz. Professor Pomeranz received his PhD from Yale University and is currently Professor of History at the University of Chicago. And for our audience, who are largely economists, could I bother you to please explain roughly what is the California School?
Okay, the California School is a rather loose label for a group of us, most of whom happened to be in California at the time, who started rethinking primarily Chinese, though to some extent also Japanese economic history, and started rethinking the kind of classic comparisons with the West. And the impetus behind this was in some ways very simple. It was that for a long, there was a period, let's say up through the 1970s, where comparison was very fashionable, but it always had the same story, right? The West was the success, capital S. East Asia was the failure, capital F. And you were always looking for that one magic ingredient that the West had and China didn't, or the one blockage that East Asia had and Europe didn't. And most of those comparisons upon closer examination fell apart. They thrived in an era where we had very, very little data. And with that, I think the whole project of comparison got a bad name. And in part within the discipline of history, there was also a kind of general revolt against social science methodology, the idea that, those guys just have too many models and they don't know the nuance the way we do. And what those of us in the California School, all of us, I think it's fair to say, had a fair amount of training in one or more social sciences. And we were interested in the project of comparison and wanted to do it better.
Could I interject and ask you briefly, who are some of the key members of the California School?
Bin Wang, now at UCLA, Peter Perdue at Yale, James Lee, who back in those days was at Caltech and is now a dean at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, myself, Bob Marks at Whittier College, Li Bozhong at Tsinghua and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And what a lot of us found as we started digging, we came at this from very different angles, but we consistently were finding some of the same things. And I think one of the most striking things we were finding is that the radical divergence in economic fortunes between East and West came a good deal later than classic stories would tell you. Right? If you go back and you read David Landis, the story's all over by 1500. If you read Deepak Lal, it's over even earlier than that. It's over in 1000. In some versions of the Madison data, it's all over. And yet, when you start looking more closely, and actually, those guys, it's not that they were bad scholars. They didn't have access to the data we have access to now. And the more you dig, the more it looks like by various standards, certainly not all of East Asia and not all of the West, but selected parts look very similar. And in fact, when I did some work for the 18th century, which is pretty late in the game, right, what you find is that China as a whole seemed to have a fairly similar level of economic performance to Europe as a whole on the eve of industrialization. And the most developed part of China, which is to say the Yangtze Delta, stacked up pretty well against England and Holland. And we'd missed that for a number of reasons. One of the reasons was the natural inclination is to compare modern nation state to modern nation state. So if you compare England to all of China, China starts to lag behind at a much earlier date. But that's in part because China is enormous and much more comparable to Europe as a whole than it is to England. In fact, England and Holland put together, the most successful parts of Europe, are a significantly smaller percentage of Europe's total population, circa 1750, than the Yangtze Delta is to China's. So if the Yangtze Delta is more or less keeping up with those places pretty late in the game, then you have a kind of interesting story, right? One in which Europe has its England and Holland, and it's got its Bosnia and its Ruthenia and so on and so forth. China has its Yangtze Delta and it has its Gansu, and you've got to be careful to compare like with like. When you do, the numbers are pretty close. And if they're pretty close, then some of our traditional explanations for why the two areas diverge don't work. So to take one very simple one, the standard argument that, well, China didn't have real private property, the West did, therefore the incentives were all wrong in China and they're right in the West. Well, if that was true, then as late as 1750, you shouldn't have had similar levels of economic performance. You should have had the divergence much, much earlier. So a whole bunch of things of the old explanations fall apart. And so we started looking for other explanations. And that, I think, is where the California school begins to become less unified. There are varying explanations within the group of what does happen. I put particular emphasis on fossil fuels on the one hand and access to extra European resources on the other as two ways in which Europe is able to stretch certain ecological constraints that I would argue all developed areas are beginning to hit in the 18th century. Other people have different explanations. But what I think we all share is the notion that the divergence is pretty late and that there is a significant difference, and this I think may be particularly important for economists to think about. There are significant differences between the kinds of institutional arrangements that facilitate the kinds of growth that are possible in a world of fairly slow technical innovation and fairly low energy supplies, essentially Smithian growth, right? Increased division of labor, trade, et cetera, versus modern economic growth. And that it's not, from the fact that you failed at the second, at least over a certain period of time, you cannot infer that your institutions were also bad for the first. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you could make a case, this is stretching it a little bit, but that in many ways the Qing state is actually closer to being Adam Smith's night watchman state than any of the successful states in Europe. And that just as Adam Smith would tell you, that turns out to be a very good regime for promoting Smithian growth. It's a lousy regime for promoting industrialization. So that's a kind of ballpark introduction. I could go on further if you want, but
I think that's fine.
Okay.
That's very good for a background for the California school. I'd also like to ask you about your book, The Great Divergence, which you already touched on. Some of the key points that have been discussed about the book have been that the Yangtze Delta had comparable levels of per capita income as the key areas in the West, England and the Netherlands, and also that England's particular circumstance of having access to coal and colonies were kind of some of the keys that have been discussed in the Great Divergence. So that was quite an influential book, and I'd like to ask you how it's been my experience that the book has been influential in different ways in different countries, and particularly in Japan, China, and the United States, and also across different fields. And I'd like to probe you and ask you what your views on that are, and why that might be the case.
Well, I mean, I think it's not surprising that it's the case that you have a different influence in different places, because, to a surprising extent, scholarship is still national or regional, and people have different issues on their minds. So in the West, I think a lot of the book's most positive influence, given the large number of Western historians who deal with the West, has been to get people to go back and rethink some of the European data, either in an attempt to prove me wrong, or in an attempt to say, hey, wait a minute, he's onto something here. And I think some really interesting stuff has come out of that, right? So one of the things that I think has become really clear, if there's one big takeaway from the book that has held up really well so far, it's that explanations based on the assumption that an agricultural revolution preceded the Industrial Revolution in the West and made the Industrial Revolution possible, those fall apart. That when you look at the data closely, it's just not there. I mean, Bob Allen, who's perhaps the best British economic historian we have, went back using some data that Li Bozhong and I and some other people supplied on China, ran some simulations, and as late as 1820, 1820 is very late, income per labor day in agriculture.
Per labor day?
Per labor day in the Yangtze Delta is about 90% of the British Midlands. And that's 1820, a point at which industry is really starting to pull people out of the countryside in Britain. And so you would expect incomes per labor day to be rising. Along Van Zanden and Lee did the same thing for the Netherlands, came out with, again, income per labor day in Yangtze Delta agriculture is about even with the Netherlands as late as 1800. So and total factor productivity is way higher because the yields per acre are like 9 times anything in Europe. So whatever the problem was, it wasn't agriculture. And that in itself, even though it's just a negative finding, is important because we had such a massive literature, whether it's the old conservative historiography praising the Tory landlord, or the Marxist tradition of Bob Brenner that says, until you get agrarian capitalism, you don't have...
In Europe.
Right.
Right, yeah.
You can't have anything.
Right.
That, I think, we have effectively shown doesn't work. And that, I think, was kind of a big deal. I think another thing that's come out of Western historians rethinking the West, and that maybe has been, I think has partially helped my case and partially not, is part of the argument I wanted to make is that, yes, China is coming up against some significant environmental pressures in the late 18th century, but they're not alone in that. And so with the help of a burgeoning environmental history literature, people have gone back to look at, okay, well, how serious, so you can't turn over a page in late 18th century European stuff without people talking about a perceived timber crisis. But how real is that timber crisis? And people have done a new round of empirical work. And here I think my argument comes off, half looking good and half not looking good. Timber, of course, is hard to ship long distances because it's very heavy. And so, yeah, there's a timber crisis, but it's patchy. What I think has held up, I would say, is the argument that what the developed areas of the world share circa 1750 is what I've called, and it's a bad phrase, but it's the only one I have, a quasi-Malthusian condition, which is to say they're not up against the margin so badly that popular subsistence is endangered, right? So you see no sign of rising death rates in China, for instance, or for that matter in Europe. But what they are is they're in a position where, without some positive exogenous shock, it's very hard to imagine a radical expansion of production. You're not, for instance, the English iron industry is clearly hitting a wall in the 18th century. Various other energy-intensive or otherwise resource-intensive industries, it's not that they're in crisis and collapsing, but they're having a hard time growing. And of course, Europe gets not one but two very positive resource shocks, right? One comes through technological change, through mining, and you get this vast reservoir of underground resources. The other comes from overseas. So I think that general context has held up reasonably well, though there are certainly places around the edges where parts of it were wrong. I think I did, for instance, underestimate how much slack there still was in room to expand imports from the Baltic, for instance, things like that. So that's been one set of discussions, and that's been largely a North Atlantic set of debates. A second thing that I think would have happened without me anyway, but happened at the same time and has fitted into the Great Divergence debate, is the work of people who are going back and trying to think about the explanations of the big technological explosion as technology. So people like Joel Mokyr, who are reviving an older argument about the particularities of European science and the ways in which that influences the Industrial Revolution, getting away from incentive-driven arguments, from Doug North-style arguments that, well, it's because you had the property rights for patents and so forth right, and saying, no, it's not that, it's in the science itself. I happen to think that the argument doesn't work for the early Industrial Revolution, it works for the Second Industrial Revolution, but nonetheless, that's an important historiographical shift that happened not because of what we did in the California School, but that took on a different valence because it emerged at a moment when suddenly there was a need for a new explanation of this phenomenon because the old one had fallen apart. In China, the story has been very different. And in part, I think this has to do with a kind of, I think it's fair to say, intellectual crisis in China, where as Marxism has lost its grip on a lot of the scholarship, people have been looking for alternatives. And in particular, for certainly not all, but many Chinese scholars who were determined to say the motor of Chinese history must lie in China. They wanted to get away from the sort of, China was this inert object waiting for the West to smash into it,
right,
sort of thing, which is a sentiment I completely approve, right? China was not an inert object. But when you look for an internal Chinese motor to Chinese history, and they take away class struggle from you, one of the things that people immediately turned to was population, right? It's clearly domestically driven, and it's clearly big. And so there was a lot of sort of neo-Malthusian arguments to the effect that, hey, look, the problem with China was simply that somehow or other there were too many people. And I don't want to dispute that the population is generating significant environmental stress in various places, or that it's exerting significant stress on a political system that can't figure out how to govern that many people. But again, if you look for the classic signs of Malthusian stress, are death rates rising in the 18th century? It doesn't look like it. Is there any sign that food prices are rising more rapidly than the general price level? Well, our data's pretty bad, but the best evidence is no. So there was something wrong there. And I think part of what's happening in China, which is very exciting, is you now have a younger generation of scholars who I think is increasingly free both of the kind of rigid sort of Marxism that was promoted for a long time and of this kind of fairly simple-minded, population-driven story. And that, they're getting all kinds of data we didn't know existed. And so we're starting to rethink this thing from the ground up. I fully expect that part of what they're going to show is going to show that the guesses we made in the California school were wrong. It's the way it is. But there's some real interesting stuff going on there. There's also, I have to say, a slightly more negative side, which is, I didn't intend the book this way, but the book has a certain appeal to Chinese nationalists who kind of hold it up and say, hey, look, we were really close really late, and some of them, because in discussing the European access to overseas resources, inevitably colonization, exploitation, the slave trade, et cetera, come in. There's even a twist in some of the Chinese arguments that says, the problem we had was that we were morally better. We didn't do those things, and therefore. So that's been a kind of less fortunate thing, but you can't take responsibility for every possible way that somebody can read what you've written.
Sure.
So the Japanese response has been different again. And I think it's come of two kinds. One has been at about the same time that those of us in the California school were doing our work. People in Japan, Hamashita Takeshi, Heita Kawakatsu, Kaoru Sugihara, were rethinking what they call, or what Sugihara at least calls, the East Asian path to modernity, arguing that rather than saying, hey, because Japan in particular doesn't get to the Industrial Revolution and sustained modern growth first, A, doesn't mean it's a failure. B, doesn't mean that some of the things that it's able to do pre-1853 aren't extremely important in helping to understand why it does relatively well after 1853. And one of the things that Kaoru in particular does that I think it's a nice move is to say, imagine you could freeze the world in 1800 and you were trying to write an economic history of what had happened over the last few hundred years with, of course, no foreknowledge of what's going to happen. But you did have good data, or you had the data we have today. What would the main thrust of your book would have been? Well, it would have been to talk about this miraculous thing that between about 1500 and 1800, Chinese population had tripled. Japanese population had somewhere between doubled and tripled. They'd managed to do that with, not big increases in per capita income, but with some increases in per capita income. And that would have been the big story, right? The East Asian miracle, right? And then you might have had a little chapter at the end that would have said, and way off at the other end of Eurasia, there's this little place that's had slightly better per capita growth.
Little island.
Right, slightly better per capita growth, slower growth in population, but it's such a darn small place, it's a little appendix, right? And obviously, since we do know what happened after 1800, that's not the way we'd write the story. But it's an important one that focuses on the fact that in a world where nobody imagined sustained high rates of growth lasting for centuries, right? A world in which Adam Smith didn't imagine that happening, right? You can read The Wealth of Nations, and it's, 600 and some odd pages. There are about 5 about manufacturing, right? In a world in which people, including very smart people, are thinking about a world of agriculture and commerce, basically. The East Asian achievement between roughly 1500 and 1800, and then one could go back further and say in earlier periods as well, looks very impressive. And we ought to think about how that happened. And so people like Kaoru had been working on that on their own. We first encountered each other at a conference in Hong Kong in '98. And it was funny. I had just sent the manuscript of The Great Divergence off to the press. And I start reading Kaoru's paper, and I have this, how has this guy been stealing my ideas kind of feeling? And he's told me he had the same reaction reading my paper, like, well, what's going on here?
Mutual plagiarism.
Right, which is not to say that we completely agree. We don't. But we had both had this idea of rethinking East Asian growth as a particular type of growth that occurs when you don't get a resource bonanza. And sure, it's more constrained than the growth you get when you do have a resource bonanza, but it's real growth nonetheless. And in world historical perspective, it's quite impressive. One of the ways I often say this to my undergraduates, and it's a little bit cheap, but it works, is to say that to deny the achievement of East Asia economically because it didn't do what Western Europe did in the 19th century is like saying, I spent all this money on my kid's piano lessons and he didn't become Beethoven. Well, nobody else's kid did either, except for Beethoven, right?
Right.
The fact that you didn't turn out to have the very best performance in the world doesn't mean that what you did was nothing. But as simple as that idea is, it's an idea that, and here we switch from certain countries to certain disciplines, I think some economists have had a hard time accepting that there's at least some, R.M. Hartwell, the famous English economic historian, actually said, economic growth is binary. It's 1 or 0. You either are a growing economy or you are a stagnant economy. And it was a binary. And I think part of what people like Kaoru and Bojong and I and others have shown is once you start looking at a place like East Asia and taking seriously that there's something important happening there, even though it's not the industrial Big Bang,
The narrative begins to change.
the narrative begins to change, and you can't just say, hey, there are places that have the secret of growth, and every place else is stagnant. It just doesn't work.
Let me interject a point or so and follow up on some questions with you. First of all, just for background, basically I would say the majority of outsiders are somewhat skeptical of the Chinese 1950s push for the sprouts of capitalism. And that was very politically driven. It came very fast and furious in a series of publications. And many people outside of China view that as basically nationalism, the goal being, well, China began to grow before the Western came, and the Western powers came and knocked them off. I've had many colleagues tell me that the reception of the California School, and your book in particular, has been very good amongst Ming-Ching scholars because it's placing them on a pedestal, and there's actually growth. We have more evidence and arguments for growth, but the Song China experts have been less so. But in any case, one thing I wanted to probe you on was in the U.S., not speaking to levels, comparing the Yangtze Delta with England, but rather growth rates. Li Bozhong has been a prominent advocate of a particular type of growth where growth can happen when existing technology is spread to other regions. And that point in particular, with people like Joel Molkir, who doesn't actually argue science is the key. He's had to adjust to what he calls macro invention. So it includes science and some other things, but these are the big movers that move the economy. They've been somewhat skeptical at strictly speaking to the point of growth rates of China in the late imperial period. How do you react to this
Okay.
this argument?
Well, I mean, I think Bojong is, to a great extent, right. That what you're looking at in, circa 1550 to 1800 in China is not, for the most part, new technologies. There are a few, but not many. It's diffusion of best practices. But what we should remember is that diffusion of best practices is a slow process everywhere in the pre-19th century world. Go back to 13th century Britain, and you will find a handful of places that have per acre yields that are not going to be exceeded until 1800. And it takes the rest of Britain, all that agricultural growth that we see from the 13th century to the end of the 18th, it's pretty much all diffusion of best practices. Slowly but surely, lots and lots of different places figure out how to get yields equal to what a few places in Norwich were getting in 1220. The Chinese story, I would argue, is, at least for agriculture, which of course is the biggest sector of every economy in this period, is not that different. You get a real breakthrough with the spread of early ripening rice in the Song dynasty, and you have a handful of places, mostly around Suzhou as far as we can tell, that already have yields in the 1300s that are about what the top yields are going to be, in the Chinese case, actually into the 20th century. It takes a long, long time for those best practices to spread, in part because farms are inherently very heterogeneous, right? Every one of them has slightly different sun and shade, slightly different slope and drainage, et cetera, et cetera. And without modern chemistry, it's trial and error, and very slow trial and error, no matter where you are in the world. So that's a big part of the growth. Another significant part of the growth is commercial. I mean, in the Chinese case, there's a big setback in the early Ming, late 1300s, where the first Ming emperor really wants to freeze everything in place. And
I just have to interject. His name is Zhu Yanzhang, and some people argue he was the person that set China back the most in imperial history. So we need to mention that. Although people talk about Mao, Zhu Yanzhang was okay.
yeah,
Anyway,
right. But after that setback, as things come out of that, it's pretty clear that you're getting the slow but fairly steady development of division of labor, specialization, interregional trade, certain amount of specialization among households, et cetera. And that fuels, again, not spectacular growth, but some growth.
Okay.
And you can see it, we don't have the kind of data we'd really like, but you can see it when, for instance, you look at the consumption of new goods. Europeans who come to China in the 17th and 18th century are just blown away by, as one British visitor puts it, everybody over 2 feet high is smoking tobacco, right? Now that's not, as it turns out, a particularly good form of growth, but it's a sign of disposable income. You see it in, and this is much more constructive, the enormous growth of commercial publishing, including pretty cheap books on pretty practical subjects, medical handbooks, child care handbooks, things like that, which is not to say that the quality of their advice necessarily looks too good to us in the 21st century, but the fact that people are buying them tells you a fair amount.
Sure.
And for the publishing, at least the big Fujian publishing houses, we've been able to piece together sales figures, and they're growing quite dramatically, way more than population. So something big is happening here. Figures on cloth consumption are more controversial. I think I'm towards the high end in my estimates. Wu Chengming and Xu Dixin, the Chinese scholars, are probably at the low end. Other people are in between. But they seem fairly high. Below the Yangtze Delta is below the UK in per capita terms, but it's up there with just about any other place you want to name. Right? And modern development economists would tell you that as a economy starts to grow, where are you first going to see the increases in consumption? Probably in non-grain foods and cloth. And fortunately, those are things for which we can piece together at least some data. And they suggest, not spectacular growth, but some growth.
So, in some, your view is that the spread of existing technology or existing best practices can increase per capita output to a notable level that we can measure it, and it's not required that new technologies be introduced. Would that be a correct rough summary of I don't want to...
Yeah, no, I think that's basically right. I mean, clearly the spread of best practices can't sustain growth forever, right? At some point, those best practices. But it can take a very, very long, that can be a dynamic that goes on for a very long time and can make a very big difference.
Okay, that's interesting. What else are you working on? What else? What's new since the Great Divergence for you?
A bunch of things are new. Some of them are not in economic history, but one of them that might be interesting in light of this is, I said before that I think the majority of the new research that came out after the Great Divergence has tended to confirm the broad outlines of my argument. But one thing that didn't, and that was a striking problem, and has led to current research, was the real wage series that people like Bob Allen and Jan Leuten van Zanden and some other people put together, which showed something that at first really bothered me, which is if you look, they don't have the data to do this for any time really before the mid-18th century on a global scale. But when they start to get, it's not great data, but data that's okay in the 18th century, at a point where I think the richest parts of East Asia are still keeping up with Western Europe, the gap in unskilled real wages is already quite large. It's more than 2 to 1. So something seemed to be wrong here. This bothered me a lot. Another fact that bothered me a lot, because it just doesn't fit with my sense of how the world works, is that if you start looking at migration in the Qing, there's this enormous amount of migration. And one of the ways in which China is, I would argue, a little bit ahead of the global curve in the early modern period is in the rise of long-distance free migration. Right? When you think about long-distance movement in the West, until 1800, it's actually overwhelmingly of indentured people, and it's pretty small scale, right? What's the figure? About 1 million white people go to the New World in the whole, first 3 centuries from Columbus to 1800. So they're dwarfed by the slave trade. They're also dwarfed, something like 8.5 million people moved to Sichuan alone, right? This is a big story.
Yes.
But the interesting thing about it is, where are the people going? They're for the most part going to the West. And if I was right...
And that's Sichuan.
Well, Sichuan, parts of Hunan.
Okay.
To some extent down into Yunnan and Guizhou, various other places. Oh, also, of course, to Taiwan. And later on, once the Qing let them, to Manchuria. But the interesting thing there was, if I was right and De Bin Ma was right and all the other people were right who said the Yangtze Delta is much richer than the rest of the country, why isn't the net flow of migration towards the Yangtze Delta? Right? That was a little troublesome.
Right.
It turns out, I think, that the answer to both those questions, the real wage question and the migration question, is the same set of institutional factors. And that's a project I've been working on. And it really has to do with property rights in the irrigated parts of China in general, but the lower Yangtze in particular. And I don't want to get into all the nitty-gritty details, but basically what evolves is a system in which, in the lower Yangtze in particular, most land either is owned by smallholders or it's tenanted, but it's tenanted by people who have very strong usufruct rights. It is hard to evict them, and therefore also hard to raise their rent. And the rent increases clearly lag behind the productivity increases, so that in the long run, the tenants are getting a larger and larger share of their product. The other thing that does is a tenant who is hard to evict starts to act like an owner. My colleagues in the economics department at U of Chicago like to say, no one in history has ever washed a rented car. But if you look at what happens to rented land in the lower Yangtze, the tenants are actually investing very heavily in maintaining and improving the land, which helps explain the high rates of productivity, et cetera, but it does something else too, because what happens is the people who have these usufruct rights, though they look to us like they're propertyless, they actually have a form of property, right? They have a partial land right, which in fact, by the Qing times, you can buy and sell separately from the subsoil right. It's a very sophisticated property system. So to put it in economists' parlance, they are not just earning the return to their labor, they are also earning the return to an asset that they own, even though we call them tenants, right? As a result, their incomes are way, way higher than those of the truly propertyless. So if you do a rough estimate, a tenant with security of tenure in the 18th century lower Yangtze with an average size plot is earning somewhere between 2.5 and 3 times what a landless laborer or an at-will tenant who doesn't have security would earn with year-round work. So that has a couple of significant, and I should say, wage laborers are only about 10% of the rural economy, whereas in places like England and Holland, they're approaching 50. So that has 2 significances, at least. Significance number 1, that helps explain how you can have this big difference in unskilled real wages and comparability in average living standards. Because when you compare unskilled real wages, you're comparing the bottom 10% of the Chinese income distribution with something that's almost the midpoint of the English and Dutch. So yeah, you can have a big spread, and it doesn't affect the larger argument, which made me feel much better. But it has other significances as well, because here's step 2. So you have this system where a wage laborer makes maybe 1/3 of what a tenant makes. And it's a society where guilds are very weak. That means that an urban employer has very little reason to offer an urban unskilled wage that's much above the rural unskilled wage, right? Why should he? That means urban unskilled wages, even in the richest parts of the country, are way below what the average tenant is earning, and significantly below what even a tenant with a smaller than average plot is earning. That helps explain why, if you're discontent with your situation and you're looking to move, you don't head for the city. You head for the frontier, right? Average incomes may be lower out there, but there's empty land, so you could actually earn that average income. If you move into Suzhou, sure, the average income is higher, but you're going to earn 1/3 of it. And so that helped explain that other paradox. I think once you understand those things, you can also understand a bunch of other things about the way the late imperial economy works. You understand, I think, why so much industry locates in the countryside as handicraft industry. You understand why that mass migration to the frontier is so large. you also understand why when the frontier runs out, as it does in the 19th century, it's such a big problem. So I think a lot of these pieces begin to fit together. And so I've been working on a manuscript, which is going to take a couple more years at least, but that tries to trace out this institutional complex based on this very different set of property rights and explain the kind of development it gives you. And it's not going to give you the Western Industrial Revolution Big Bang, but it gives you real growth for centuries.
Right. Well, it sounds very interesting. I look forward to seeing your book when it comes out. I'd like to end by asking you a couple of very general questions, which are themes from XVIIthIstory.com, our blog. And that is the Western economic view of the world, from economists' point of view, roughly speaking, is that the world and each country roughly goes from a Malthusian trap to modern growth. The only issues being when and how. And I'd like to ask you, does China fit into this model?
On the whole, no. And I think it's really interesting that the more we look, not just in China, but in a bunch of other places, the more a true Malthusian trap is actually hard to find. Ironically, you may find it more in the 20th century, where there are some places that experience very, very rapid population growth because of medical advances without much in the way of economic dynamism. But in the, you find a lot of what again I would call a kind of quasi-Malthusian world where there's some growth. They're slow but measurable, moves up. I don't think there's any question that a Tokugawa peasant eats, dresses, etc., much better than a Muromachi peasant.
Yes.
You can excavate the houses, you can look at the descriptions of the clothing, you can reconstruct lifespans.
And the Muromachi period came before the Tokugawa period.
Yes, right. And there's just no question that, sure, there are reverses, but there's a movement upwards. And they are far from alone.
I see.
So, I don't think the pre-industrial world is truly Malthusian. The Chinese story is kind of interesting because, ironically, in parts of Mao's China, because of the institutional arrangements, you may have actually gotten closer to a truly Malthusian condition than before, right? So, in places, on the one hand, there's a genuine Maoist achievement, right? The horrors of the Great Leap accepted, life expectancy doubles. On the other hand, they institute tremendous institutional rigidities. You get this, more than doubling of the population. People in the countryside are not allowed to move to the cities. Communes are discouraged from moving some of their surplus labor into non-agricultural pursuits. So you could argue that some of the conditions that people used to attribute to the past actually may exist more, at least in certain places, in China in the 1960s or 70s than they had in the past, right? So, if you look at what Philip Huang calls involution, right, where he says what you get in China is a situation where you have basically no options other than agriculture, and therefore you keep adding labor to your plot even when the marginal returns have become incredibly low. So if you have nothing else to do, you weed for the 37th time, even though weeding the 37th time produces only a tiny, tiny increment of production. I think Philip may well be right as a description of what's happening on certain communes in China, because there was government rules that said you cannot take that labor and try to make cloth with it or whatever.
Right.
Ironically, in the period that Philip wants to say you had involution, that labor is going into cloth. It is, so one of the big stories of Chinese economic history from, say, 1300 to, even down to 1900, is the defeminization of agriculture, right? That women, basically, they don't leave the farm physically, right? They stay married to their farmer husbands. But more and more, they're not participating in agriculture. They've moved into other things.
Handicrafts and so forth.
Right. In the 70s, they're not allowed to move into other things.
I see.
But I think we also need to remember Malthusianism, and Malthus himself recognized this at certain points. Ricardo certainly recognized it and writes about it actually quite well when he talks about comparing Ireland and England. Malthusianism, subsistence is not simply a biological notion. It's a social notion, right? It's below what point, where do you hit a point where people say, you can't make me work for that. It tends to come way before biological subsistence. But it comes at different points for different places, right? Because social expectations fit in, right? If somebody who doesn't have certain basic material possessions cannot find a wife, for instance, then in a sense, a social constraint becomes a biological one, right? You do not actually need to own a table and chairs, for instance, to survive biologically.
Right.
But once a table and chairs become part of the socially understood minimum, right, such that nobody's going to marry a guy who doesn't even own a table and chairs,
Right.
that becomes subsistence.
I see.
Right? And I think what you see under, you can complain, at any given moment, you will find people saying that X, Y, and Z are being driven down to the subsistence level. But what subsistence means changes over time.
Right. I see.
In 1400, nobody thought that part of subsistence was being able to offer some tobacco to your friends.
Right.
Because nobody had it. By 1600, certainly 1700, even pretty poor people around the world, that's just part of my right.
Right.
And obviously, that's not a biological necessity, right? But it's become taken for granted.
I see.
Unpatched clothes in certain parts of the world come to be taken for granted in a way that they weren't, right? A leather belt rather than a rope. Biologically, it makes no difference, but it comes to be taken as expected. These are small but significant upticks in standard of living, the same way that a switch from a Model T to a Hyundai Elantra, right? Biologically, no difference, right? Either one is just a machine for getting me somewhere, and one is a bit more convenient and comfortable than the other.
Right.
But that's an improvement in standard of living.
Sure. Okay, well, one final question I cannot resist asking, and you also roughly touched on it at one point. Given certainly the quantitative data is not nearly of the quality that even they were looking at since the 1500 in China. Speaking of the Song Dynasty, taken as a whole, quantitative and qualitative data, what's your view of the economic performance of the Song Dynasty, just roughly speaking?
I mean, there's clearly some very significant growth going on.
Economic growth.
Yeah. How much is very hard to say. I mean, I think the most extreme optimists, Robert Hartwell, for instance, probably overestimated. And again, it's partly about the difference between invention and diffusion.
Yes.
So in the Song, we know that a bunch of stuff shows up that hadn't been there before. And so you can find, for instance, lots and lots of gazetteers that say, people are now growing this new kind of rice, it ripens earlier, they are squeezing in a second crop. That's very, very important. What we don't yet know, and given the quality of the data we may never know for sure, is that a handful of people, or is it spreading through the whole county?
Right.
That's very hard to know, but even if you take the pessimist's assumption, there's just a handful of people, that's real growth. Hangzhou, which becomes an immense city by the 1100s, 1200s, that can't happen without agricultural surpluses growing, right? There's somebody's got to be feeding those people.
Just to be clear, so the economists understand this, you mean per capita income growth and population growth?
Right, both.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So, again, it's probably not the kind of per capita income growth that, it's not 3% per capita per year the way we get used to in the 20th century.
Right.
But the 20th century is freakish.
That's right. Not even late 19th century.
Right.
The growth is much higher than I think we could imagine in Song China.
Right.
But anyway.
But there definitely is growth. And again, you can see it in certain qualitative indicators. In the Song, you get the first boom in commercial publishing. It's not as big as the Ming-Qing boom, but it's clearly there. And again, people don't buy books if they're up against the wall.
Right.
And it's not just gorgeous illustrated manuscripts clearly aimed at the elite. There's also a surprisingly large amount of publication of stuff on cheap paper, written in simple rhyme so that the one literate member of the household can read it out loud and the other people can memorize it.
Right.
Which is, little rhymes to tell you things like what you should do for your sick child, or,
how you should take care of your health.
Or at what time of year you put
crops
the crops in the ground, and so on and so forth. There's a market for that, and the fact that there's a market tells us something.
Okay. Well, that concludes our interview, and we're quite grateful to have your time, and thank you for having us over for an interview, and we hope you enjoy the remainder of the World Economic History Congress here in Kyoto.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Been a pleasure.